a warm welcome to our podcast, Robert Lyman. It's a pleasure to be talking to you today. And this week, of course, is Remembrance Week, when we pause to recall the sacrifices of previous generations. So it's a very good opportunity for me to begin with a question which links that to your book. I wanted to ask you, how is the Burma campaign remembered today, if indeed it's remembered much at all? What would you respond to that?
It isn't really remembered, and I've been concerned about this for many years, not just because it's not remembered in the UK and amongst those countries for whom we have a right and a duty to remember. It was our army, of course, fighting out there against the Japanese. It's not really remembered in India either, and that's for me an even greater concern, because the majority of the army fighting the Japanese in 1944 and 45 were Indian. In fact, 87% of General Bill Slim's fantastic 14th Army were Indian. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Very briefly, the first reason is that following independence, a narrative built up in India, a very common one, that there wasn't any real history, Indian history, prior to 1947, because it was tarnished both by the colonial oppressors and by the presence of Muslims who had been subsequently exported to Pakistan. And it's a very strongly Hindu-dominated narrative, and it exists and it's quite powerful. And I think it's time that India rethinks its history, because actually pre-partition India was a history of the subcontinent. It was the history of India and its peoples coming together. And even more importantly, it was a history of the Indian people as a whole, now in what is constituted Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, rising up and of their own volition, fighting the Japanese. India in 1943, 44, 45, fought for the right things. They fought for their future, they fought for their freedom, and they eventually got it, and they fought the threat against it. And for all those reasons, we need to remember the war in the Far East, and we need to remember it over here. I mean, interestingly enough, Peter, during the war, the troops, certainly the British troops, very early on came up with this idea that they were the forgotten army. And this simply came from the fact that when the newspapers from the UK finally arrived, 6 weeks after they were published at home, the boys would flick through them and see nothing in them about their campaign, their very, very significant campaign against the Japanese. And they then started calling themselves the Forgotten Army. Later in 1943, Mountbatten, who became the Supreme Commander, Southeast Asia Command, sorted that out and appointed an editor, previous Fleet Street editor, Frank Owen, to create a newspaper, the SEAC newspaper, which became phenomenally successful. Actually, Frank Owen was a marvelous journalist, and he knew what the boys wanted, and he gave it to them in spades. And it's it's very interesting reading copies of it now, because it's a very intelligent newspaper aimed at the boys and their needs and concerns, their worries, but telling them about what was happening in the future. So that Forgotten Army idea came from then. It's a little bit of a myth now when you consider how much has been written about the Burma campaign subsequently. The historiography of the campaign is now running at probably about 12 or 1300 books. Most of them are captured in the Burma Campaign Memorial Library in SOAS in London. So it's not forgotten anymore. But having said that, in popular memory, it is still forgotten. I mean, if you just did I haven't done this, but I would imagine that if you did an analysis of all the books that are published every year on Normandy and Northwest Europe and compared them to all the books, or the very small number of books published about the war in the Far East, there'd be a massive difference.
Mm. Well, one thing I was wondering is, because in a way it's a messy narrative, isn't it? And this kind of goes right to the heart of the title of your book, A War of Empires. It's not a simple A versus B conflict. Yes. And right from the beginning, because when I was preparing for this interview, I was thinking about it, and I had looked at a BBC propaganda film from 1945 when they talk about the victory in Burma, and they talk about behind the redemption of Burma lies the dramatic story that is a symbol of the United Nations in victory. Their triumph was achieved in a magnificent example of inter-allied cooperation, the combination of the British together with the Indian Army, American fighting men and engineers, Chinese divisions, Burmese levies, and many more whose deeds brought courage and hope to millions across the world. Well, that just captures, doesn't it, how complicated a story that you've set out to tell is.
I think it's a very good point, actually. It's quite a daunting task trying to get your head around all of this. To be fair, I've been doing it for 30 years. I mean, this book really is a culmination of 30 years of thinking and lecturing and talking and writing on the subject. It's been fascinating because as the years have gone by, not only have I learnt more, but I've understood more, and I've understood the complexities of it. And of course, the really important thing about all this, I mean, you've touched on it, and that propaganda, it's a bit harsh to call it propaganda, but that publicity film from 1945 really does capture the essence of the achievement. If I just tell you that in 1945, Southeast Asia Command, which was commanded by Lord Mountbatten, comprised 1.3 million men and women. Of that 1.3 million, 300,000, extraordinarily, 300,000 were Americans. And we often forget how important the Americans were to this entire story, not least of all because they gave the engine power to the strategic requirement to support China. Included in that 1.3 million were some Chinese troops, but that number was Southeast Asia Command, and it excluded the divisions thrown into battle against the Japanese by Chiang Kai-shek, with whom we were in strategic alliance. And of those 1.3 million men, only about 100,000 were Britons. An extraordinary number. There were almost as many Africans in the Southeast Asia Command, about 90,000, as there were Britons. The remainder were Indians. And this is the extraordinary thing that's sort of been developing in my mind over the last quite some time, 8, 10, 12 years, that this really was India's war for lots of reasons, not just at a tactical level of fighting, but also at a political and a national level. And the reason for this is very simple. One might ask, why did so many men, primarily men, but also women, join the Indian Armed Forces after the fall of Singapore in February 1942, when everything seemed to be over for the empire? They joined, I argue, because they were fighting for the government of India, which was defending India's territorial borders and its interests, and they were fighting for the future. They were fighting for what they could make India become. And they weren't fighting for the Raj, not at all. In fact, no one at the time even used the word Raj. It was the government of India. There's another word for government of India, which was in widespread use. Rajas tend to come into, it was really an East India Company term, and also a term that we've come to use more often in the last few years. But actually, Indians didn't see themselves as being subdued or coerced by the Raj. They were obeying the call of their government. And I think there's a really important point in all of this as we rethink the Far East. And I'll come back to some of the nuances in a moment. But one of the really important things for me is recognizing that we have in all of us an essential, at least a duality. We can understand, even if we are nationalistically inclined, we can also understand, actually, there's a threat to my welfare and well-being and my security, and I'm going to have to do something about it, even if it means allying myself to someone I don't particularly like doing. We do that every day. It's a function of our human nature. We're very good at coming to these judgments and applying them in a personal way, and we're also very good at doing it in a political way. And that's exactly what happened in the Second World War in India. Men and women who were nationalistically inclined, and General Auchinleck, who was the commander-in-chief of India, a British officer in the Indian Army from 1943, that's when he was commander-in-chief, made the comment that he would expect all Indian officers in his army to be nationalists. And it's a fantastic point. Not only were they nationalists, he would expect them to be proud of and want to have their own secure future for India, but they were doing so at a time when they recognized that there was an existential threat to India from Japan. Many, many years ago, I interviewed an Indian veteran of the war who, in a moment, switched on the light bulb in my head. And he said, when I asked him about why he joined the Indian Army, with that assumption, I think, resonating in my voice that he was joining a foreign army, he said, he looked at me after he paused a moment, he looked at me and he said, "Rob, you need to understand, we were terrified of Japan. we knew all about Nanking. We knew about the rape of Nanking in 1937. We knew about Japanese depredations in China. He said, Rob, we read the newspapers. And he joined up and became a hurricane pilot, in fact. And he said, all my friends from school, he was 18 or 19 in 1939, 1940, we all joined up when we realized just how close the Japanese were. And the Japanese were very close. They invaded Burma in 1940, they invaded India rather in 1944, a fact that we should not forget. And yet India has largely forgotten, and the world indeed has also forgotten.
This is,
just a little aside. Sorry, Peter, I just want to make this point about how important all this was. People don't know of the Burma campaign or the Far East campaign because it's very easy to get confused about terminology. So the way to think about it is the war in the Far East was focused on Burma, even though much of the fighting also happened in India. It was the war on the Far East because that was known as
it's the kind of crucible of action, isn't it?
Yes, exactly right. But we often abbreviate it to the Burma campaign. And to the right-hand side, as you're looking at the map, you've got the Pacific campaign led by the Americans, and to the left of India, you've got the Middle East campaign under the control of the British. The Far East is an important cog in a global war, and it's a really important cog because this is actually where there were two foci, two key points of action by the Japanese. One was defending their Pacific islands, controlling the Pacific, and the other was defending their possessions that they'd captured in their coup de main attack in December 1941, early 1942. And that was largely split between the Far East under British command and the Pacific under Admiral King under American command. But that's just a little bit of terminology to get everyone's heads around the titles. But the focus for us was Burma, was the recovery of Burma. And interestingly enough, it was the recovery of Burma, not because it was a British colony, it was the recovery of Burma because it was a fundamental stepping stone into China. It was the route by which American, primarily resources, could travel into China. That was the strategic purpose of the campaign. So whilst we have forgotten some parts of the Burma campaign, we've actually really forgotten the strategic dimension to it, the reason for it, the rationale for Allied operations in the area in the first place.
Yeah, the point I was that was just passing through my mind is kind of one that fits on the tail of my last, which is that we said before, it's quite a daunting task to look at this particular episode in history because it's messy, but it's also is so rich. There are all these different protagonists, there's different points of view which you can take, and I suppose that's the reason why you've been able to sustain an interest in this over such a long period of time. And it's actually really satisfying for the reader to get the benefit of that when you're going through that you do. And I think this is something that you don't actually always get in history books, and something that maybe challenges us today in the way that we have a very first person kind of interpretation of the world. We live in our heads, so it's quite difficult sometimes to empathize with the other. And at one point, I think you actually point out, well, hang on, we've got to actually think about the Japanese as well. What were they thinking? And we have some quite interesting scenes which take us right inside the Japanese military machine, where decisions are being made once when someone's in the bath. I'm trying to remember which particular
yes, and Motoguchi in particular. Do you know what a very perspicacious comment you've made, Peter. That's absolutely right. I think that the problem is with history is that we need more often than we do to stop and to ask ourselves the questions, but why did they make that decision? It is too easy to apply a template from our own experience to the past and to assume that people behave and think in the same way then that they do now, and it is completely wrong. And it's a lesson I've learned over the years. I was, I think, in my early years as a historian, quite quick to judgment. I have learned to be a little bit calmer and to understand the context more. In fact, I bang on quite a lot, certainly when I'm teaching, about the need to really, really appreciate the entire context of the environment. And one of the classic cases in this book is the entire context of Japanese militarism. In fact, I will come back to that at the end, because militarism was the at the heart of Japanese behavior. It ran through the entire civic DNA of Japan as a culture. There were some very cultured people in Japan, but militarism wasn't something to be ignored. In fact, it was very, very important. And the behavior of the Japanese commanders in Burma was really quite extraordinary. Just go back to your first point. I feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to spend so many years reading, writing, and researching the Far East, to travel out there so often, and to meet the people and to understand it. And I need to say that my views have changed over the years. I think when I first approached it, people call me a military historian. I don't particularly like that phrase. I'm a historian, a social historian. I study what happens when people make decisions, good or bad, and certainly the bad ones, and they end up in war. But I'm not a historian of tanks and rifles and weapons and uniforms and all that. Since I'm not really interested in that sort of stuff. I'm interested in what happens when people engage in warfare at a political and a social and economic sense. The level of their reality, the level of their identity, and who they think they are, and their sense of self, and why they fight and why they don't fight. To me, that always strikes me as being the most important.
Yeah, and obviously the context is revealing the personality of them, isn't it? The kind of very deep personality, which is kind of hidden often in everyday life. But I must move us into our format now, because I could talk to you about this for the whole afternoon. It's fascinating, but we have some business at hand. And it begins by me asking you a question I always put to people when they come on the podcast, which is, if I could give you the opportunity to travel back to a year in the past, and it's going to be a year in this story, I know, which one would you select? And I know there's going to be
I'm going to give you a caveated response. I love the format, by the way, and I really enjoyed thinking about it in preparation for this. I am, of course, going to go for 1944. It's the year of it's the year in which the situation in the Far East completely changes. Certainly for the Allies, from bad to good. It's certainly improved dramatically, and for the Japanese side, it goes from very good to very bad. It's the year of culmination. It's the year in which all the disasters of 1942, the disasters for the Allies associated with the Japanese invasion of the Far East, are overturned or overcome. And I spend quite a lot of time in the book just trying to answer those questions, why it was that a dramatic transformation took place.
Well, the years that you cover in your book are really 1941 to 45, but with the focus more specifically on 42 to 44. Is that a fair appraisal?
That's absolutely fair, yes.
And there's kind of bits, there's bits of the other years in there as well. But I think that what we're going to talk about today really is almost like the second act of a play, isn't it? We're leaving what went before to one side, but I think it might be useful for our listeners if you just sketched what that first act would have been. I mean, it's really a story of which is kind of familiar from the kind of blitzkrieg stories we have in Europe. It's a total domination by the Japanese military machine, astonishing conquest. I mean, in fact, at the start of your book, you put a very nice chronology. I like a chronology, but for the first, 2 pages of this chronology, it says Japan takes this, Japan marches into there. It really is a list of astonishing military kind of victories. That's what happened in 42, 43, really, wasn't it?
It did. And I divide the book into 4 parts. And right from the outset, I wanted to give people a structure to think about these great events, because I know there are a lot of words there, and it's very easy to get lost in the detail. And I would encourage you not to do that. But I start off with what I call hubris, arrogance. This was the arrogance of the Western Allies, that they could deal with any Japanese threat should it ever occur. And I then go into hiatus. My third section is resurrection, and the final section is redemption. But in hubris, we basically have a very simple story of the Japanese who had been at war in China for many years, certainly at a large scale since 1937, and estimates are very difficult to come by, but I think Francis Pike, who's written extensively on this, comes up with a figure of about 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. I think that's probably about right, probably a little bit less than that by 1944, but a very substantial number. The Japanese have been fighting for a long time. They're a very militaristic society. They had very significant political dysfunction, in the sense that the armed forces effectively ran Japan, but there were 2 very significant parties in the armed forces, a fight between the army and the navy, and even within those, the army and the navy, there were separate tribes. So it really didn't operate as a state should. And the argument, the reason for the 1941 invasion of Southeast Asia was largely driven by arguments between the army and the navy about the success or otherwise of fighting in China. It's really as simple as that. It seems quite extraordinary to consider that now, but that's the case. And the Japanese had a lot of time to prepare for the invasion of Southeast Asia. They had managed to take, without any fighting, French Indochina in 1940, following the defeat of France in Europe. And they then prepared to exploit that further on. And they prepared thoroughly. They'd had a year to prepare their invasion launches, their tactics, their weapons. They pulled everything together. And what was the West doing? Absolutely nothing. And this is really a story of failure of 2 decades of defense planning. Britain and America, certainly through the 1920s and 30s, had begun to be worried about the Japanese, but frankly had done nothing about it and had not prepared to meet the threat that was self-evidently developing apace. And if you don't prepare to defend your country or your territories or your possessions, then you absolutely deserve to lose them. And that's the real story of 1941-42. The Japanese were phenomenally well prepared, and the Western allies, so the Dutch, the British, and the Americans, were absolutely not, and were trounced as well. Very large numbers of prisoners going into the bag, as the saying went, and Japanese success. The second phase is, which is what I call hiatus. This period of waiting to see what would happen is really a story of Japan's extraordinary inability to exploit the wonderful victory it had achieved. The political, superficially, the political rationale for the invasion was to kick out the Western imperialists and to create what they called an Asia for the Asiatics, the co-prosperity sphere. Of course, that was nothing more than a rubric. There was no evidence, not a jot of ink had been expended in Tokyo to design a new civic polity in Southeast Asia and these countries that they had occupied. And it was a complete mess. The army was in charge. The army had put no effort whatsoever into rethinking thinking how this Southeast Asian sphere could be created. We get to 1943, and a puppet government is established in Burma, which is basically the extent of their civic restructuring. And it's a disaster for Japan because they do nothing to create the empire that they set out to achieve. And it actually burst the bubble of Japanese imperial pretensions. And we can see as a consequence of this exactly what lay behind Japanese imperial ambitions. It wasn't a desire to bring good to the people of the Pacific. It wasn't even a desire to create a new economic sphere. It wasn't even to attempt to create a wider or a larger Japan. Japan was actually inherently racist as a country, and they didn't really like to include anyone who wasn't Japan in their political environment. That was also very clear. It was simply a matter of finding the fuel, the rubber, the bauxite, all those materials that were desperately needed by the Imperial Japanese Army in China to keep on fighting. So if you don't have any imperial plan, or you don't have a plan for your empire, you're really on a very, very you're in a difficult place from the beginning. And that's what happened to the Japanese. Now, at the same time, the Allies pulled their fingers out and they started doing what they should have been doing at least 10 years before and preparing to defend their possessions. And the story of 1943 is an extraordinary one, actually. And very briefly, it's the story of the resurrection of the Indian Army. The Indian Army in 1939 was effectively a paramilitary force designed for what was known as military aid to the civil power. It was about 200,000 men strong, and it was recruited from about 40% of the population, from what the British used to call the martial races. So those parts of the country where loyal soldiers could be recruited and developed. Well, the story is that by the end of 1945, over 2.5 million men and women had joined the Indian Army. At the end of the war, the Indian Army was about just over 2 million strong, which was an extraordinary achievement. And it was extraordinary at a number of levels. First of all, it was the largest volunteer army in the history of mankind. No other army in the history of mankind has ever exceeded the Indian Army's recruitment campaign in 1943 and 44. The other thing is to say that there wasn't really a recruitment campaign. This is something that historians are only just beginning to grapple with, which is how and why did so many young Indian men want to join the army at a time where the Raj appeared to be under threat, and if you believe the Japanese propaganda, would soon be in the hands of the Indian National Army, which is a puppet army of the Japanese created from prisoners of war, Indian prisoners of war after Malaya and Singapore. And they joined in very, very large numbers indeed, and they didn't really need to be corralled. There is a narrative in India that says, well, they were coerced into fighting the Japanese by the British, or they were coerced because they were hungry and they needed employment. All those things are important. You know, young men join the army in all eras for mixed motives. But I think we need to accept that a large number of Indians, as did my veteran many years ago when I was talking to him about his motivation, were scared about what the threat the Japanese posed to Japan. And my very good colleagues, Dan Marston, Professor Dan Marston in the United States, and others have argued, he particularly in his book, Phoenix from the Ashes, where he describes the resurrection of the Indian Army, that this was really quite a phenomenal achievement. And he argues, and I agree with him, that this was effectively a creation by India, by Indian people, of one of the great structures of civic society, the armed forces. And it was a new army created from across India, not just from the martial races. So it gave it a completely new complexion. And this is really, really important. And it is very interesting, as opposed to the argument that some people make that the Indian Army was militarized as a result of the Second World War and caused partition in 1947. There is absolutely no evidence for that. In fact, that's a little bit of a perverse argument. The reality is that a disciplined Indian and disciplined Pakistani army actually did a huge amount, and the evidence is very clear on this, to keep the communal violence where it occurred to obey. There are very, very few instances, if any, recorded of Indian or Pakistani army units actually getting involved in any of the communal violence. Their job, and they did it very well, was to put the lid on it. But it's a very important point here that we have in 1944 actually, a new army, an army that hadn't existed in 1942 and was now ready, well trained to fight the Japanese. A couple of other little things that need to be mentioned here. In order to be able to create this very large army meant the industrialization of India. India didn't have a very strong industrial base. It had traditionally bought everything it needed from the United States or the United Kingdom, which had very large manufacturing capabilities, and they needed to be built in India for the first time. And a very large number of airfields and roads and railways and so on were built in order to be able to sustain the fight against the Japanese in the northeastern territories of Manipur and Assam, and then in 1945 into Burma itself. That was an extraordinary effort, and many millions of Indians were employed in this. This debt was being accrued against a bill that would be paid for eventually by Britain. So a very significant rebuilding, or not rebuilding, a building of India's economic structures took place as a result of the war. Now, we would wish it were otherwise. We would wish that that industrialization took place in a different context, but that's as it is. That's what happened in 1944-45. And then we have resurrection, which is the fact that when in 1944, the new Indian Army ended up fighting the Japanese in a place called Arakan, now Racine State, along the Bay of Bengal, they smashed the Japanese advance towards Chittagong. And later that year, in fact, a month or two after, when the Japanese main invasion began against Imphal and Kohima in Manipur and Assam, it was also smashed by August. General Watergoodyurenya's army was destroyed and pushed back across the Chinwan. All the survivors were pushed back. And it was the high point of the time at which everything that had been prepared the previous year came good. It was the dividend on the investment, as it were. And then in 1945, in what I call redemption, it's the year in which Allied strategy for the first time was achieved completely in the recovery of Burma. I just need to quickly add, people always ask me, well, why on earth did the Japanese go into Burma in the first place? Was it to seize rubber and tin and rice and so on? The answer is no. The Japanese wanted Burma because it was the Rangoon, the capital of Burma, was the source of the Burma Road. The Burma Road ran all the way up to Lashio by train and then into Yunnan province and Chongqing in China by road in order to sustain the operations that Chiang Kai-shek and the Cantonese army, the Kuomintang, were managing against the Japanese. And the Japanese had long been irritated by the Burma Road, and their ambition was simply to seize Rangoon. In fact, in 1942, when they did launch a land invasion, they were so phenomenally successful, they got to Rangoon very quickly and then carried on throughout Burma. And by May 1942, Burma was in Japanese hands. They hadn't expected that at all. The aim of Allied strategy was essentially to recover the Burma Road in order to continue providing Chiang Kai-shek with the resources he needed to hold the Japanese at bay. So just consider for one moment what might have happened if, let's just say there were 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. They were withdrawn from China because China had been subdued and the government had reached a compromise or an agreement with Chiang Kai-shek. Those men were then let loose in the Pacific against the Americans and the British in the Far East. It doesn't bear thinking about. So the strategy was correct. There's no doubt about that. And recovering Burma wasn't an attempt to recover Britain's lost empire or colonies. It was to retain and maintain continued support to Chiang Kai-shek. And that's effectively the story. 1945 is really a dramatic story because whilst the Indians smashed the Japanese invasion of India in 1944, and they proved their ability in defensive battle, they, in 1945, proved their ability in offensive action as well by storming across the Chinwan and then the Irrawaddy, seizing Mandalay and driving incredibly into Rangoon to capture it before the monsoon came. This is a really important point, actually, because I'm always really struck by how dramatically successful the Indian army in Burma was in 1945. This was a new army. These are young men who had been in short trousers at the start of the war. And I have made this point to my friend James Holland, the historian, who has recently produced a book on a cavalry regiment, or an armored regiment rather, in Northwest Europe, called Brothers in Arms. And we were talking about this the other day, and I said, isn't it interesting to think that whilst these long-term territorial army units had men who had served throughout the war, most of the soldiers in the British Army who were fighting in Northwest Europe in 1944 had been teenagers at the start of the war. They were trained up, recruited and trained in 1942 and 43, and 1944 was their first action. It's the same in India and Burma, Imphal, Kohima and Burma, 1944-45. These were young soldiers who had been recruited in 1942-43, trained up. The Indian soldiers had 11 months of training, and a number of them I've read, were quite happy to say that their training was harder than actually fighting the Japanese, which just goes to show that if you train hard, you can often fight a little bit easier.
Okay.
And it's very interesting what you can do with a large army of men who are motivated to fight the enemy, are prepared to sacrifice their lives for the enemy because there's a great ambition at the end. And the great ambition, of course, in Europe for these young Britons was to defeat the Germans and get home to see their families. And it's exactly the same in India. Burma. Defeat the Japanese and get home and see the families, do the big job that had been asked of them, and go home to an India that would be changed for them. It's the same for British soldiers. They wanted to beat the Japanese and the Germans, go home and create a country that was fit for heroes. And as a consequence of that, they voted Churchill out, as you know, in 1945, Conservative Party out, and a huge political change took place.
Well, let's have a look a little bit more closely at this history then, because you picked a few dates out during, well, we did say 1944, but we have a little bit of an asterisk against it because it's such an important scene in this story. So we're going to allow it for you today. And of course, every story like this needs to have its kind of leading cast of characters. And there is one in particular which kind of personifies this whole story more than anybody else. So you're going to take us to meet him at this moment. Where do you want to go first, please?
Well, I'm going to go to the Chinwen River. It's a few months before 1944, so it's December 1943. The Chinwen is effectively the border between Burma on the right and India on the left, and the province is Manipur. And it's an incident where General Bill Slim, who was the newly appointed commander of the new 14th Army, which had been raised to fight the Japanese, had an opportunity to meet men of the new Indian Army. Now, these were men from a battalion of about 700 men of the Madras Regiment. They were the divisional defense battalion of the 23rd Indian Division, and they were on the Chinwen in defensive positions with the Japanese only a few miles away across the water. Now, this is quite an extraordinary scene, and it's in the book, and it's
in the book, and I should actually point out that it reads almost like a piece of fiction because you have dialogue in there. There's kind of rich description. There's this character Slim, who I'd only ever really known in hologrammatic form. He's kind of got a great name, so General Slim sounds almost like a Johnsonian character, doesn't he? And that's all I knew about him. But reading this, I think it's like a little prologue to this section in the book.
It's a prologue.
It comes across absolutely extraordinary.
It is extraordinary for lots and lots of reasons, and I'll try and keep this short, but it is very exciting. The protagonist is a man called John Twells, who's a young officer, lieutenant in the Gurkha Rifles. And he, for some reason, is attached to the Madras Regiment for a time. And he observes all the Indian soldiers as this great man, their army commander turns up. Now, they don't know that he's a great man. In fact, he's actually unknown to them, to Bill Slim. Bill Slim had been in Burma since 1942, and actually was one of the reasons why the British Army and the Indian Army were able to recover themselves so dramatically. He was an extraordinary character, but he had huge human sense about him. He understood how humans worked, which is not something you can always say about every general. So he's remarkable in that respect. But I think the point about this particular occasion was that General Slim stood up in front of the men and said, I'm going to speak to you in 3 languages, and I'm going to explain what we're doing, what you're doing here, and what's going to happen in the future. He then proceeded to tell them in Hindi and English and probably Gurkhali as well, or might have been Urdu, it's very hard to tell, that the Japanese were only a few miles across the river, but in 2 or 3 months' time, they were going to invade India. But they were not to worry because he had a plan. And his plan, he told them, was to withdraw out of the path of the enemy and back into the hills of Manipur around the Imphal plain, where the Japanese would be extended and vulnerable. And that's exactly what happened. And the extraordinary thing is here we have General Slim telling the soldiers of a new Indian battalion, private soldiers who had only been in the army less than a year,
various languages.
in various languages, what the plan was. Now, I've never, ever come across anything like that. I mean, very smart soldiers like Montgomery in the Second World War learnt that the more he told the boys on the ground face to face, the more he would trust them. Slim seemed to know this intuitively. And one of the soldiers said back to Slim, aren't you scared? Aren't you concerned that this message will get to the Japanese? And Slim said, no, I trust you. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And the extraordinary thing is, subsequent to all this, of course, it all happened exactly as Slim had planned and as Slim had told them. But the other really interesting thing about this plan was that it was an unusual plan. Remember, by 1944, we had done a lot of retreating in the British Army to this date. And the idea of retreating any further was not held in high esteem by anyone in Delhi or London. And when Slim put his plan together, it wasn't accepted by all, but he stood his ground. His new boss, Lord Mountbatten, agreed with him. And the idea was essentially to withdraw in the face of the Japanese advance, to wear them down, to be able to get to a final point in the Imphal Plain where he didn't need to withdraw any further. He would be, or his 14th Army would be reinforced by air, and that effectively his lines of communication, as they're called, would be short, and the Japanese would be extended. The Japanese had a penchant, as you will know when you read the book, for aggressive advances. They used to call them, the name of them was Kiramuni Sakuzan, which was a lightning advance. They had learnt a lot actually from Blitzkrieg in 1940. In fact, General Yamashita had visited France and had been taken around the battlefields by German officers, and he knew, and he seemed to think that the way to defeat the British was always by this Kiramuni Sakuzan. On this occasion, however, and by this time in the war, the Japanese had completely failed to understand the nature of the dramatic change that occurred in the Allied armies, and were not in any way, shape, or form expecting the response that they got when they invaded Manipur in 1944. It was really quite a dramatic shock to them. And Slim was quite happy to tell the soldiers of this battalion what was going to happen. And history has now, history very quickly demonstrated that this was the right plan for the circumstances.
Well, it's not just the right plan. As you know, it's one thing having a plan, it's another thing executing it. And communication is so important. I don't know, from your knowledge of military leaders at this time within the British Army, or maybe you could say even today, is there anybody else who could have done what he did if you were to substitute Slim with a different general? I mean, there's a nice, before I let you answer that, actually, I'm going to give you a nice snippet from his speech, which is, maybe it's a little bit of flattery in here, but it does kind of dovetail with what you were explaining before about the creation of this new Indian army, which is such a central point in your book. He says, and he's addressing the troops directly here. So he says, the Indian army, over 2 million men, all voluntarily recruited, is the greatest volunteer army the world has ever known. An army in which all races, all castes, all regiments, all men are equal and have freely volunteered to rid the world of tyranny. This is almost Jeffersonian. All India can take pride of that, and we can all take pride in our service. He's just, I suppose, he seems to have an inner charisma, which he's able to transmit, and not just transmit it to people of his own kind of tribe, if I can use that in an anthropological sense, you know,
yes. I love that. It is absolutely right. I wrote my PhD on Slim many years ago. It was published as a book called Slim, Master of War, and I refer back to it in this current book. But it's very interesting that Slim was very well. He was an officer in the Indian Army. He transferred after the First World War from the Warwickshire Regiment via a circuitous route into the 6th Gurkha Rifles, and he always saw himself as an Indian officer, or an officer in the Indian Army. When he had an opportunity in 1942 to sit down and think through the lessons of the retreat from Burma in 1942 and to work out a way of defeating the Japanese, he started with an understanding of human nature. And he said to himself, the soldiers that we recruit into the new army to defeat the Japanese need to have a spiritual perspective. They need to understand that why they're fighting, and that there is a moral good attached to it. And he said this is very easy to do because the Japanese were so totally alien. Their way of war fighting was so brutal and effectively unacceptable. And it wasn't difficult to persuade Indian men to join the Indian army, as I've mentioned earlier, because they could see that the Japanese were brutal and they didn't want to live under that sort of polity. He then said, I need to create, so he created what he described as a spiritual structure. There was a very clear ethos and set of values around the army that he was building. He said, all my soldiers also need to have a very clear understanding intellectually of what we're trying to do. We need to know what we're doing. We need to know how to fight the Japanese. We need to know their strengths and weaknesses. We need to know how to respond to them. So our doctrine, our tactics, and all that sort of stuff, this deeply mental stuff associated with thinking, needs to be perfected. And a lot of thinking in 1943, a lot of time rather, was spent trying to understand how best to defeat the Japanese, and all to very good effect.
You kind of imagine almost that if he was alive today, he'd be a pretty good CEO or something like that. Because
well, interesting enough, at the end of the Second World War, he was recruited to be effectively the chief executive of British Rail. He didn't last long because the government under Attlee brought him back and he became chief of the Imperial General Staff. Yes, I mean, absolutely fantastic director of the board. Very, very important. And then his third pillar was material. We needed to have the right things. And he said, of course, there's no way that I'm going to be able to, with the Germany First policy, be able to get all the things that I need in the Far East. I'm going to have to make do with what I can do myself. And that itself is just really a quite extraordinary thing. The lines of communication, when you think about the length of the operations in geographical terms, we're talking about trying to fight a war around Warsaw from London. It's really quite extraordinary. When his army got to the Chindwin in December 1944, he had no boats to cross the Chindwin, so he built them himself. He built 550 10-ton barges from trees that the army felled from along the Chindwin to cross the river. 550 10-ton barges. I mean, that's a measure of this guy's greatness. He was able to put in place a huge infrastructure with very good leaders to be able to do the impossible and to carry the men with him. And I think the really telling thing is that Indian soldiers loved him. They came up with this phrase, Uncle Bill. It didn't come from British soldiers. It came from Cha-Cha Slim Saab.
Yeah,
Uncle Bill.
That's nice, and it kind of goes to what I was about to ask you, which is whether he was respected in his own time. I suppose a slight different take on that is whether he was respected in his own time by his fellow officers. We can maybe get onto that in a minute, because I know we're going to go and have a look at Whitehall in a moment. But there's a nice quote that I know that you have mentioned when talking about Slim before, which is, "Never forget the smell of a soldier's feet," which is I'm not quite sure how to. It's kind of Wellingtonish kind of thing to say, isn't it?
It's very Wellingtonish. Yes, I mean, it is. Just talking about Wellington, it's very interesting. Way back, and I can never remember the date. It was either 2011 or 2013. The National Army Museum in London held a national debate as to who was Britain's greatest general, and John Snow, Dan's dad, and I came equal, with him presenting Wellington and me presenting Slim, and we laughed about it afterwards, because actually Slim, I think, was they were both great men, but they both recognized that the power that they wielded was through the smell of the soldiers' feet, is through the men who fought for them, and it was entirely driven by the willingness of these men to sacrifice their all for the common aim. Well, and it's very, very rare to see it.
This is what makes this scene so charged with narrative power, I think, because you do have a great operation about to commence, but at the heart of it, you have this figure who, as you explained there, ranks among one of the greatest figures in military history from Britain's point of view, and he's communicating effortlessly, if I can say that. He's communicating well, let's put it that way, because I can say that. And to be there to see it would be quite something, I imagine.
Well, that's why I'm glad that you had picked up on this. It is one of the seminal moments in the book, for all the reasons that I've described. And if I was ever given the opportunity of going back to a point in time, I would go back there, and I'd like to sit there and watch and listen, knowing the future, of course, seeing the power that this man had. It was a power of words, it was a power of trust, it was a power of attitude and commitment and confidence. And the interesting thing is, all these young men from Madras, for goodness sake, believed it. They believed it. And many years ago, in 1999, I interviewed George MacDonald Fraser from House in the Isle of Man, and he said much the same thing. He said, the interesting thing is, when we were visited by Slim, which happened on a couple of occasions, Slim told us what had happened. He told us what was happening, and he told us what would happen. He said, every time he did that, it happened, and we then knew that we could trust him, which is a really interesting measure of success for a general.
Absolutely. Let's keep going forward. We've got 2 more to get through. The next one, do you want to take us? We're going to exchange Asia for somewhere quite different.
We're going to go back to London, and we're going to sit in the office of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke, in the War Office in Whitehall. The building still stands. It's used for different purposes now, but this was where all operations for British Armed Forces were managed around the world. And although responsibility for military strategy and the direction of operations in the Far East actually sat with Mountbatten, Admiral Mountbatten in Kandy, in Ceylon as it was then, clearly Sir Alan Brooke was really interested and really concerned about the fighting. Now, the Japanese invasion of India began on about the 14th or 15th of March. There were some operations before then, but if we say it's the middle of March, by the end of April 1944, it was clear to everyone fighting on the ground that the Japanese bolt had been shot. It was to take quite a considerable amount more fighting to completely defeat the Japanese, but they had lost the battle. And the war after, the fighting rather in Manipur from the end of April onwards was a slaughter of Japanese manhood. It was one of the great tragedies in modern times that the Japanese would swap a poor plan for the lives of their soldiers, and they did it repeatedly in the Far East. Now, so why is in June, Sir Alan Brooke sitting down, writing in his diary, I'm really concerned about the fighting in Manipur around Imphal. It doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere. Now, that's really quite extraordinary because this is 2 months after the war effectively had gone Britain's way in the Far East. It was simply a matter of continuing the fighting and mopping up the Japanese and making sure that Motoguchi retreated across the Chin with as few troops as he could. And it says a lot at a number of levels about the relationship between the British Army and the Indian Army. There had been a very long, a deep-seated prejudice in many places in Britain towards the Indian Army, reflected not least of all by Winston Churchill. And it's very sad because actually this is very unfair. The Indian Army in 1944 was pulling Britain's irons out of the fire in the Far East and defeating the Japanese in a way that had never been expected. And it took, and perhaps, I was just going to say, it took a long time for anyone in London to understand that. I don't think they ever did. And I think this is evidence of Sir Alan Brooke in June either not being briefed or not understanding the briefs that he was getting from Mountbatten.
I was thinking that there's either, it seems like there's two interpretations that you can, well, two central ones that you can put on that. First of all, there's really poor communications and they're not on the ground and they haven't gathered the detail for some reason. But that seems, I mean, you did say before that the troops had this great stagger of time before they received newspapers from home. So there must have been some level of disruption. Or, yes, as you say, it's something to do with a prejudice against the ability of the armies that are fighting. They don't have the full confidence.
There's a little bit about, there's a little bit about the prejudice, but there's also, it's really important to note that the war in the Far East was a very low priority. Well, it was a lower priority than the war against Japan. And you could just imagine after a very heavy day, Alan Brooke sitting in his office, getting a 2-page memorandum from Kandy and skimming it and not spending a huge amount of time in really understanding.
And we have to remember as well, sorry, that this is happening at the same time as Overlord and all these operations in Europe.
Exactly right. This is exactly right. This is the 1st of June 1944, so it's 5 days before the invasion of Europe and D-Day. And effectively, London had outsourced the problem of defending the Far East to India and to Mountbatten in Kandy, and were just receiving briefs. But they completely misjudged and misunderstood the nature of the dramatic change to the Indian Army and the dramatic successes that were even then being wrought against the Japanese in the Far East. Never really fully understood it. It's very interesting when Wavell, who was now the Viceroy of India, he had been the Commander-in-Chief until June 1943. So this is a year later, when he came to Imphal to inspect the battlefield in October 1944. So he had been out of it out of military command for 18 months. he said, I didn't really understand this battle. It seems to be fought in little penny packets. So he was one of the greatest military minds of the age, so far as the British were concerned, not really understanding what Slim and his 14th Army had managed to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It always comes back to this fact: what would have happened had we not had Slim? And it's a subject for another podcast.
I suppose, in a way, it is a two-edged sword, because I imagine this lack of scrutiny or day-to-day interest in what's going on might actually amplify Slim's ability to do whatever. He can be a bit more maverick. He can come up with plans as he wishes.
You've put your finger on it.
Yeah, but
that's exactly right. He really was given a free hand. I mean, certainly 1944 that was the case. At the end of 1944, a new organization. His commander actually wasn't Mountbatten. It's a very interesting set of dynamics here, because throughout 1944, Slim actually reported to Sir George Gifford, who is head of the 11th Army Group. But George Gifford was a nice old duffer who basically let Slim get on with it because he knew he was delivering. And Slim created a really effective relationship with Mountbatten. He never ignored Gifford, but he often just went directly to Gifford's boss, Mountbatten. The two got on very well. Now, Gifford left in November 1944 and was replaced by a new commander of a new organization called Allied Land Force of Southeast Asia, Sir Oliver Leese, who had been commander of the 8th Army in Italy. Now, he had been sent off from Italy. He hadn't really done as well as Alexander had hoped, and he was effectively promoted upstairs to command Alcee, but he turned up in the Far East with what Slim described as sand in his shoes from North Africa and so on, and started to dictate terms and to believe that, as indeed he had the right to create the plans to fight the Japanese. But sadly, Oliver Leese wasn't streetwise enough to understand how things had worked in the Far East and were still working, and the importance of Slim to the construction of Mountbatten's plans. And they fell out big style, and Oliver Leese tried to sack Slim. Mountbatten didn't deal with it very well, and Leese himself was then sacked in turn by Allenbrook. When he heard about it, Allenbrook fired a rocket back to Kandy and told Mountbatten to sack Leese and appoint Slim in his place. Because even though in June 1944, Allenbrook didn't really understand what was going on, within a few months he recognized the true value of what had been achieved and the architect of that success, which was Slim. Really quite an extraordinary set of stories. But you are right, at the heart of this, Slim had the ability to do things in the Far East and to get away with stuff because no one was telling him to do otherwise. And Mountbatten just signed off on his plans and his ideas.
Well, let's go to your third scene then, because I think we see the culmination here of exactly what you're talking about. And it's again, well, there's a few things I want to ask you about here. So where are we going to go first? Can you tell us, please?
Yes, we're going to go down to it's called, we're going back to the Chindwin River. It's not far from the first scene in December 1943. This is exactly a year later. And this is, actually it's not, it's a little bit earlier. It's the 10th of September 1944. And this is a place called Setong. And Setong was where men of the 11th East African Brigade, men of the 14th Army, reached the Chindwin for the first time following the great battles of Imphal. They pushed on down to the Chindwin to chase the Japanese across the river and to establish bridgeheads themselves. So this is a really important part of the story, really, really important for a number of reasons. First of all, they're African soldiers. African soldiers had been recruited through 1942 and 43 and had arrived in the Far East in great numbers. And there were two full African brigades, the 81st and the 83rd West African divisions and the 11th East African Brigade. And they played a very significant role in the war, a role that has, to all intents and purposes, been forgotten. And it's a great tragedy in our analysis of the war to realize how little we know of what the West and the East Africans achieved in Burma. And I didn't have the time to go through that today, but I do describe it in the book. It really is quite an extraordinary series of affairs. But here we have an East African Brigade arriving at the Chindwin, having the Japanese at the end of their bayonets crossing the river. Another quick point to say, for those who aren't aware, the great battles in Manipur in 1944, from May 1944 through to October, were fought in the monsoon. Now, the monsoon really is a dramatic impediment to life in this area. Depending on what particular part of the hills you're in, you can get as much as 400 or 500 inches of rain a year, and it all arrives during the monsoon. So to put that into context, if you're listening to this podcast in the UK, we get 34 or 35 inches a year. So the amount of water that cascades through these mountains is just really quite extraordinary. And the 14th Army fought through the monsoon and pushed the Japanese back across the Chinwin from September through to December 1944. So here we have a complete reversal of fortunes. Japanese had arrived in March, they'd been smashed in Manipur, they were then forced back across the Chinwin in December, and at the hands of an Indian and African army.
When I started this conversation, I said I didn't know much about this campaign before I read your book, but one thing I did know, and one thing that was always mentioned, was that Burma was the one place you really didn't want to be sent. The fighting was horrific there. I mean, apart from the brutality of the Japanese, who had been fighting for longer, beyond 1939, they'd been fighting for a long time, so they'd grown, I suppose, used to combat in different ways. But there was casualties, there was malaria, there was jaundice, there was dysentery, there was scrub typhus, there was jungle sores. This is, and even when you look through the photographs that you have in your plate sections in the book, it feels like, I don't know, the Western front of the First World War seems kind of pleasant by comparison. Is that correct, or is this just?
That is absolutely correct. And I because I've been there so many times, I start to forget this. But of course, not only have we got really, really hilly terrain, these are the foothills of the Himalayas running from the Brahmaputra Valley through to the Chinwin. They're 5,000 to 7,000 feet high. Because they're relatively low, they're covered in jungle. It rains like billy-o between May and October, and all of the diseases you described are horrendous. In fact, in 1942, for every one soldier killed or injured by the Japanese, 120 went sick, mainly because of malaria. One of the things that Slim put in place in 1942-43 were prophylactic and support processes for malaria. And it was a really, really key part of being victorious in 1944-45. And the Japanese ignored malaria whatsoever entirely and suffered dramatically as a consequence. But it was for all those reasons that this was a very difficult place to fight, and not least of all the fact that the soldiers thought they were a long way from home, but they thought that they weren't supported in the way that they considered themselves.
And this is the forgotten army idea again.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. Which brings us back to that. But I suppose in a very strong way, our ideas about that kind of fighting has been very much coloured by the Vietnam War, which obviously came later, and we have these great cautionary exclamation marks which kind of arise in our minds whenever you think of these things. But you argue in the book that Slim did the right thing by going in, because I know in Whitehall there was a preference for, kind of steadily, and he was very intent on taking the northern part of the country, wasn't he? And that's exactly what happened.
That's exactly what happened. I mean, this all stemmed back to 1942, where actually Slim knew that the Japanese weren't Supermen. They could easily be defeated so long as he had the right, properly trained troops with the right equipment. And he always had the idea, quite correctly, that actually the Japanese had a penchant for overextending themselves. And if they could be overextended, they could then be defeated in detail. And that's exactly what happened in 1944. Whitehall, and particularly Churchill, had no interest really in getting back into Burma, although there was a strategic imperative to do so, to support the Chinese and to restore the Burma Road. What Churchill wanted to do was to launch an amphibious attack against Rangoon and avoid being caught up in Burma altogether. He called it, on one famous occasion, akin to jumping in the sea to fight a shark or to wrestle with a shark, or in another phrase, to to remove the quills from the porcupine quill by quill, something like that. It wasn't an attractive proposition. And yet Slim knew that with the defeat of Mutaguchi's 15th Army in 1944, the ideal opportunity for retaking Burma came by following on Mutaguchi's coattails, capturing northern Burma, the area down to Mandalay, which was incidentally the area where the Chindits had been involved in early 1944, and then pressing down with his new army to Rangoon. So just to give you an idea of the scale, of the geographical scale, from Mandalay to Rangoon, we're talking about the same distance as from Paris to Marseille. So a massive commitment and task. And yet Slim knew that he would be able to do it with his new army, certainly with the way in which the army had been reconstructed. And this is really quite an extraordinary thing to think about as well. The defensive army, the battles that he fought in 1944, were battles that were largely infantry-based, lots of artillery, and some tanks. In 1945, where he'd have to fight a war of maneuver, he needed to rebuild his army around armored divisions and armored corps with Sherman tanks, mobile infantry, mobile armor, all connected to effectively cab ranks of close air support aircraft flying above them and operating as an integrated whole. And you might think that this was something that would take a very long time to design and to plan and to train people to do it. By 1945, the Indian divisions in Burma were operating in exactly the same way, with the same degree of effectiveness as Allied troops were operating in France, fully integrated armored formations advancing and defeating the enemy. It's really quite an extraordinary testament to the Indian soldiers who formed the bulk of that army and who made it happen. And Slim also knew that the Japanese by this stage hadn't thought through what it needed to do to fight the British. We had come on so much relative to where the Japanese were, and Slim knew their weak points and exploited them ruthlessly in 1945. I mean, I do come back to this a number of times. It really was a great tragedy that so many Japanese were killed unnecessarily. They died on the whole in 1945 because they were seriously outclassed by the Allies.
And you make the point as well that really, while the Japanese were incredibly effective in the early 1940s, they didn't really adapt as a fighting force at all. It was still the same army in 1944 as it had been a few years earlier. And therefore we get this kind of tale of two armies, don't we? Which is, I suppose, one of the central dynamics in the book, which is the pivot. But let me ask you one last question about Uncle Bill, because I feel like he's the star of this show. Maybe he is, and maybe it's the Indian Army. Who could say that the two of them together? But is he remembered with any sense of affection in India today because of that bond that there was between him and his troops? Or is this something you're trying to rectify with the book, indeed?
Well, I'm trying to bring it to a wider audience. He is, for those who know, Slim is regarded in India as the man who saved India and who commanded an Indian army to do that. And that's absolutely right. And Slim was. It's very, very hard, when I was doing my PhD, to try to be objective about him. I think I was as much as is humanly possible to do. And I identified him warts and all. But the decisions he made, so the military strategic decisions he made, were all the right ones. They were all the right calls, even though they were hard ones to make. And as we described earlier, he was able to do it by keeping his Indian soldiers around him and believing in him. And that's always the key thing for a general. Generals are supposed to be leaders. The only way you can be a leader is to have followers. And followers are individuals who voluntarily and of their own volition decide to follow you. They don't follow you because they're told to. That's not the definition of leadership. And Slim was able to have that triumvirate linked together very well and very successfully. And without Slim, I'm convinced that we wouldn't have had anywhere near the degree of success, if at all, in the Far East. He was able to fight the Japanese at a military strategic level and an operational level and a tactical level, whilst at the same time rebuilding the army and pulling together and giving it an esprit de corps that was second to none. So yes, in India, for those who know, Bill Slim is well regarded, as indeed he is in the UK. And it's very interesting. People ask me, well, could you have taken Slim out of the Far East and put him in Europe, and would he have been as successful as Monty? I think absolutely, and I think actually, to be fair to Monty, vice versa. Monty was a very good organizer. He was a very good thinker and was very successful in the 24th Army Group. He irritated a few people, but that's what comes with the job.
That's
and
getting
I think
things done. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was, he had to get a job done in 11 months and did a remarkable job in doing so in Northwest Europe. But I think Slim would have done a very good job in Northwest Europe with the tools that he had.
It's a wonderful, I don't know, it's just a wonderful full counterfactual history, isn't it? You could have I don't know, you'd have to sit down with a piece of paper and work it out. But from what you're describing, absolutely, yes, if it comes down to qualities and personal traits.
Well, I think the point that was actually made by Ronald Lewin in his biography of Slim in 1976, won the W.H. Smith Literary Award that year, was that Slim was able to do all this with nothing, with very little equipment. And I think that's the real measure of his achievement in the Far East, that he was able to do it by making everything up as he went. So when they ran out of silk parachutes, they made them out of cotton or jute. Quite extraordinary. And when they ran out of parachutes, they did lots of free drops. They built boats. They built roads. They did things that were really quite extraordinary when you look at them now in detail. There was no waiting on resources. There was no waiting to do an operation because they didn't have the resources. They made it happen. And that was quite an extraordinary affair.
It's an enthralling story. It's all here in a war of empires, along with maps, with chronologies, with, as I said, these little prologues, which feel like a change of pace. It's a book which is going to absorb many a reader. But I've got one last question before I let you come back to the year 2021, which is when the book is being released, of course. If I allowed you to bring one tangible memento back from the year 1944, is there anything from this?
Yes, there is.
History
I would bring back a katana. Okay. A katana is a samurai sword. Now, Slim brought back a katana because it was a sword given to him by one of the Japanese generals surrendering in Singapore in 1945. I would bring it back actually not because I like swords and I wouldn't put it on the wall, and I'm not much of a person for that sort of stuff, but it does symbolize the end of Japanese militarism. So these katanas in many cases were several hundred years old. They were family heirlooms. They represented the high point of Japanese militarism, and handing them over to Allied officers at the end of the war demonstrated the defeat of militarism. It has enormous historical significance, these katanas, in the end of a culture of militarism that brought the world to its knees in between 1937 and 1945. And I'd bring that back to remind me that militarism has no virtue. It only creates disaster.
Absolutely. It's an object full of historical power, full of historical weight. And there's also the picture of it being handed over to Slim as well, which is so symbolic too. Rob Lyman, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Congratulations on the new book. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's been a real pleasure to be with you, and I love the format.